Hello and welcome to the Business Channel, today brought to you from the seat of government, Westminster, and we're looking at the health of the British manufacturing sector. First up, let's talk to Omar Qureshi, who is a partner and head of anti-corruption at the law firm CMS Mckenna. I asked him first of all why the Bribery Act is of particular concern to manufacturers and other organisations.
Well, the Act creates 4 offences. What it actually does is to in part consolidate previously existing legislation and common law offences of bribery, but also improve upon them and bring them up to speed with the modern world. So it creates 2 offences, what are called general offences, if you like, of bribing or being bribed. So it catches not only the person that is trying to bribe someone, but also the recipient of the bribe. And it doesn't only capture people who actually give a bribe or receive a bribe. Merely offering or requesting a bribe is sufficient in that context. Then there are 2 other specific offences that the Act creates. One is a discrete offence of bribing a foreign public official. And that particular offence was designed to enable the UK to show that it had fully complied with its obligations under the OECD's Convention on Combating Foreign Bribery of Public Officials. And it's quite a different test. And actually one of the more easy tests to fall foul of, to be guilty of a corruption offence. So that's why there's a particular concern about companies and individuals who have dealings with foreign public officials in connection with their business. And then the 4th and final offence, which is perhaps the one that has received the most press sort of comment and criticism, if you like, is a corporate offence where a company that fails to prevent bribery will be guilty of an offence.
So how common do you think bribery is in the manufacturing sector?
Well, it's a difficult question. Transparency International, one of the more well-known organisations that assesses corruption risk, has a thing called the Bribe Payers Index, and that assesses corruption on a sector basis, business sector basis. And based on their studies, the heavy manufacturing sector is considered to be one of the more sort of high-risk areas, if you like, for corruption, whereas the light manufacturing sector is actually considered to be relatively low level for corruption risk. But at a more general level, corruption is a significant problem around the world. They have another study which they call the Corruption Perceptions Index, and it ranks 178 countries around the world by reference to the likelihood of their public officials to request or require bribes in the context of business. And what it shows, if nothing else, is that nowhere is immune to corruption. Even the cleanest countries have some degree of perception that there is a corruption problem. But what it also shows is that more than half of the world, on their study at least, comes out as being high risk from a corruptions perspective. So it is a real problem.
So how should directors of companies protect themselves? I mean, presumably there's a whole grey area of things which are just conditions attached to deals which are not bribes.
Indeed. The Bribery Act itself doesn't contain many defences, if you like, to the offences under the Act, but there is one defence, and that's a defence specifically aimed at corporates. So corporates can protect themselves against the corporate offence by putting in place what's called in the Act adequate procedures, which are designed to prevent bribery occurring. And essentially what that means is that company boards ought to consider their business in all its sectors and focuses and countries of operation and the ways they do business in the different places that they do, and assess the risk that they face in all of those areas from a corruption perspective, and then design policies and procedures that are designed to meet those risks and minimise so far as they can, taking a reasonable and proportionate approach, minimise the risk that bribery will occur.
What are the ramifications for companies who are trading internationally or who are being encouraged by the government to trade internationally?
Well, the ramifications in theory at least are no different, but in practice, because if you trade internationally you're facing different risks perhaps than if you're only trading at home, because as we've already discussed, different countries are exposed to different risk factors in respect of corruption. Depending on where you trade, you might find it more difficult to do business cleanly than if you're trading in the UK. Some countries have a slightly different approach to corruption. Some cultures are different. In some countries it's almost expected that certain things have to happen for business to be done successfully. So corporates will face those additional risks if they operate in those more difficult environments. But nevertheless, they will still be expected to take those reasonable and proportionate steps to try and prevent corruption occurring in connection with their business. And if they don't do that, And if it comes to light that business that they have conducted was won partly or fully through corrupt practices, then prosecutors will take a very dim approach, a very dim view of that, and will approach those companies accordingly.
Well, Omar Qureshi from CMS Mckenna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Manufacturers need finance, just like any other business, and the government also has its role to play in making the economic climate right for expansion, as we hear now from Mark Prisk, the Minister for Business and Enterprise.
I think the government has a very important role in encouraging manufacturing by being a good and effective partner. That doesn't mean trying to run the businesses, it means creating the right long-term environment. So a simpler tax system that reduces the corporation tax rate, so money can be reinvested back into industry and into capital. Making sure that in skills terms we're actually improving and increasing the number of apprenticeships so that industry gets the skilled workforce it needs. It means investing in infrastructure so that actually the UK is an efficient place in which to do business. That's why we're retaining the spending levels for infrastructure that we've inherited from the last government. And it's why we're investing in high-speed rail to make sure that we get that improvement in public transport. So I think the crucial point from government role is to be an effective partner, always wanting to look at how we can improve the conditions of manufacturing here in the UK, because I'm always mindful that we are competing with countries abroad. So we've always got to make sure the UK is a good place in which to do business. I mean, I know talking to businesses that they do find that accessing finance is a problem. We should remember that 2/3 of the smallest businesses get the money they seek in terms of loans or in terms of overdrafts, and in fact nearly 85% of medium-sized firms also get the money that they're actually seeking. So it is a problem, but it's not quite one that affects every business. But what are we doing about it? Well, first of all, we've asked the banks, and they've now brought forward a lending code and an appeals process so that if a business has a problem, they've got a means by challenging the bank if they think they've been dealt with unfairly. Secondly, we've also made sure that we are helping in terms of the enterprise finance guarantee, so government is underwriting loans made by the banks, and we think this will unlock about 2 billion in loans over the next 4 years. Then on the equity side, just as important if you're growing your business, we're investing 200 million in what we call the enterprise capital funds, and these are targeted at the high-growing, capital-intensive businesses, sometimes in industry, other times, for example, particularly in the low-carbon field. So it's that rounded approach, I think, as well as new initiatives on things like supply chain finance, that we think will actually free up the market and give businesses much more choice.
Now, transfer pricing is a useful tool for companies to employ, and Wendy Nichols, partner and head of transfer pricing at Grant Thornton, the business advisors, started by telling our reporter Jane Bennett-Powell what exactly it is. Joining us now from the business advisors Grant Thornton is Wendy Nichols, head of transfer pricing. What is transfer pricing?
Transfer pricing is the way that a business will determine how much of its profits are taxed in different countries. So any business which has operations in more than one territory needs to be thinking about transfer pricing.
Who does transfer pricing affect?
Transfer pricing can affect all sizes of manufacturing businesses, from privately held businesses perhaps making their first foray into overseas markets, do some licensed manufacturing or some having some shared services or a distribution arm overseas, right up until the largest listed companies, and all sizes of businesses ought to be thinking about and managing this aspect.
UK manufacturing companies which do trade internationally are concerned about international taxation and transfer pricing. Are they right to have such concerns?
International businesses should be thinking about transfer pricing as one of a number of things that they think about in terms of managing their business costs and their business risks. And it is an issue for the boardroom to be concerned about. There's about 130 countries now that have transfer pricing rules, and a lot of them are enhancing and bringing forward more onerous rules, all the time, including countries in Central Eastern Europe, China, India, and very recently Russia has brought out some new transfer pricing rules for people to consider.
What are the implications if a company doesn't take those obligations seriously under UK and international law?
If a company doesn't think seriously about its transfer pricing, there is the first and most obvious risk is that they will have double taxation. So if you think about the profits of the group as a cake, if two tax authorities are fighting over the same slice of the cake, you may end up with tax twice on the same profits. And then added to that, you can have interest, penalties, management time, professional fees in dealing with this, and reputational risk, which itself is a thing that companies should be thinking about more and more these days.
How do you ensure that clients have up-to-date information on international taxation and transfer pricing?
Grant Thornton International member firms are at the forefront of consultations with bodies such as HMRC and the OECD, which takes a lead in matters of transfer pricing. We also take the pulse of business regularly with things like our International Business Review, and the next issue of that International Business Review will be dedicated solely to this issue of transfer pricing.
To summarise then, for the revival in UK manufacturing to really take hold, how important is it for companies to correctly arrange their tax affairs and to take their obligations of transfer pricing seriously?
I think it's crucial for manufacturing companies as they grow out of this recession to think about not only the incentives that there are coming in under the corporate tax system, such as the reduction of the corporate tax rate towards 23%, research and development tax credits, the new patent box incentives, and to make the best use of transfer pricing regulations to get the best tax answer for their business.
Wendy Nichols of Grant Thornton, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
It can be tempting to stick to highly developed markets for exports, but one of the founding partners of the import-export consultant Strong & Heard, Sandra Strong, told me this isn't necessarily the case.
Highly developed markets appear attractive, but there's going to be a lot of competition in those markets, and that means that your profitability may be reduced. They could be good to start with, and it gives you a chance to look at the exports, but really companies should be looking further afield as well, looking at some of the regions that the UK have set up trade agreements with, where they have special arrangements for UK manufactured products going in with less restrictions.
It may seem an obvious question, but what are the advantages for companies for exporting, or does some of the time that all the trouble outweigh the advantages?
Well, there's been a research done by UK Trade Investment, which is very focused on developing companies in overseas markets. And one of the things that they noticed was that if a company goes into export, then they stand about a 11 or 12% advantage in surviving any depression or recession, because they're broadening out their actual base. They can also increase productivity. There is greater profit out there than keeping within your own domestic market, and it can help you develop your product line as well by taking into consideration other countries' needs and requirements. So it makes you much stronger. Productivity actually increases around 35% on companies who try and focus some of their markets outside the UK.
So is it expensive to begin exporting, and what are the risks?
It can be expensive if you don't do the planning correctly. So you need a good market research, make sure that you can actually develop in that market. UK Trade Investment are very good at working on that kind of development. But then you need to commit your own resources to it as well. If you do it right though, it is very profitable. So the risks are outweighed by the profitability of it.
Can exporting be profitable for any sized business?
Oh, definitely, yes. We work with a lot of small companies, sometimes just 2 or 3 person teams, who have helped the productivity of their product by going into overseas markets. They wouldn't be as profitable as they are if they didn't do that. It doesn't matter the size of the business, it's down to the marketing structure and also taking advantage of the customers that are out there and not just limiting it to the UK.
And to sum up, what sort of advice would you be giving a company thinking about exporting for the first time?
Make sure that you take advantage of the free information that's out there, but also make sure you have good practical advice so that you are asking the correct questions. There's too much information sometimes and you need to be guided. Don't try and do everything at once, but take it slowly and with good help. And there's a number of businesses like ourselves who will help companies and support them through the whole process. And that's what you need, support.
Sandra Strong, thank you very much.
Nice, pleasure.
Some UK manufacturers then are alive and well, but is this because they're more competitive or just because there's a weak pound? Terry Schooler from the EEF, the manufacturers' organisation, gave me his take on this.
Manufacturing is on the up because of a combination of both the competitive pound and I think the ability of manufacturing leaders to take advantage of the recovery. The competitive pound has undoubtedly helped since the latter part of 2008. But British manufacturing leaders have demonstrated the resilience. They've kept labour force and skills during that recession, and through the process of innovation, they've demonstrated that they can take advantage of these recovering and emerging export markets.
Now, which sort of manufacturer is doing particularly well? Which of your members is driving the revival?
I'm pleased to report that all sectors across manufacturing are performing well. That there's the possibility of a downside here in terms of construction. Construction came out of the recession slower than the other parts of the sectors, and of course it's patchy. But other than that, this is across the board. Difficult to highlight any particular part of the sector, but if I was to, I'd probably quote mechanical, heavy investment, mechanical engineering, perhaps linked of course to those growing, emerging and export markets.
How attractive do you think manufacturing is as an activity in its own right? Isn't it better to find a high value idea and then let someone else make it?
I think there are two issues there in terms of describing the attractiveness of manufacturing. I think one is we have to recognise that over the last couple of decades, manufacturing has not had a particularly attractive or good image, and I think it would be wrong of us not to recognise that. But I believe that is changing, and I believe it's changing quite strongly as a result, in part from that recession. I think the other point you make is of course linked to where manufacturing should take place. Manufacturing is a great wealth generator. About 53% of our exports come from manufacturing, about 70% of our research and development in business comes from manufacturing, and of course it's a double positive whammy when we export what we've got here. And I think there is a clear link, whether or not we wish to face up to it or not, there is a clear link that where research and development is undertaken, in the main, that tends to be where the manufacturing or production takes place.
I mean, it can't be denied, though, that labour costs are so much cheaper in other countries, like in the Far East. And how can we compete on manufacturing if we're having to pay so much more for labour?
You're absolutely right. Labour costs, of course, are cheaper in the Far East and indeed in other parts of the world. But cost is only one aspect of competitiveness. You know, quality is clearly a big driver. Aftermarket or customer support as we call it, and of course continuity of supply are also very important issues.
Do you see Britain as being just a location for small scale specialists, or do you see large scale manufacturing happening?
No, I don't see us just as being a place for SMEs as we call it. We have a very strong SME market. I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 or 3 decades we have seen a large number of British manufacturing assets being bought up, and therefore we do have an issue, and it would be wrong not to state it, that we do have an issue therefore that we do not have as many larger companies, say above 250 or 500 employees, as some of our other competitor nations. But As I mentioned a moment ago, we have a very strong SME base, and one of our challenges here in the UK is to grow that base and make those companies substantially bigger and stronger.
Well, Terry Schooler, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
In the drive to get profits through the door, it's a mistake to forget basics like health and safety. Barry Tupper, Operations Director with IOH, Industrial and Organisational Health, told me how he works with clients. As occupational health consultants, what is your main approach in working with a new business?
We assess what their current standards are and how they approach health and safety at work. We do an audit of their practices, and then we try and get them to improve on their current practices and see where we can improve that by putting our professional staff in there to assist them to do that.
What are the key areas to focus on in achieving cost-effective safety?
I believe it's including health and safety at the planning stage, making sure that it's an integral part of the engineering process for any new projects that are being introduced, any workplace improvements that are being introduced, making sure that all of the staff are aware of the health and safety issues that may be arising. An example of that is the work that we did up at Nissan with introducing some press machinery for the new press plant, a 5,000 ton press, which was the biggest press to be installed in the UK, made by Hitachi in Japan. We spent a lot of time with the design engineers in Japan, designing the safety systems, making sure they were right and making sure that it was safe to bring into the UK. We introduced a three-stage buy-off process, so we inspected it in Japan to make sure it was correct and safe, installed in the UK safely and inspected again, and then inspected a third time before it was handed over to production for final use. And getting all that right at the planning stage saves considerable costs for refurbishing, re-engineering at a later stage if you get it wrong. So that is essential. And what was the worry with the press, that someone would get trapped in it? Yes, it's a huge press. You can park a transit van, for example, on the bed of the press, and you wouldn't get two chances if it came down on top of you. So you have to make sure that it's fully integrated safety systems in there. Yes. Are there any particular sectors, say manufacturing or other sectors, where health and safety is most crucial? Well, I think in all sectors health and safety is crucial, whether it's within an office environment where you have a lot of work with display screen equipment, for example, and the employees see the stresses of working very closely on telecommunications and that sort of thing, down to engineering works where you have high risk of machinery and chemicals. So every industry has its risk. So you cannot say that there's no risk in any industry, or some is less than others. Sickness absence in local government, for example, is much higher than in manufacturing. So it is important in all sectors. And finally, what benefits do companies get out of good health and safety management? The cost benefits are enormous. We're trying to encourage employers to make strong leadership in management and from the directors of companies to make sure that the cost benefits are assessed and seen. Very few companies actually do a cost benefit analysis on their health and safety, how much their sickness absence costs them, how much accidents cost them, how much ill health costs. The cost to the British economy of ill health at work is estimated between 22 and 100 billion per year, which is enormous figures, and you try and put that across to an SME, for example, it just goes over their heads. So you have to do some assessment on their impact, on what their sickness absences cost them and what their accidents are costing them. And that's quite simple to do. There are tools out there to assist you to do that.
Intellectual property protection is essential in safeguarding designs, unique industrial processes and formulae. Francis Preedy, Senior Manager at the International Trademark Attorneys Hallmark IP, talked to me earlier and started by defining what exactly trademark means.
A trademark is what sets out to the public what are your goods or your services and distinguishes them from somebody else. If someone sees your mark, they're going to recognise that as coming from you, that they're going to be of a particular quality, and that in the future, if they're going to buy those goods or services again, they're going to continue to be of that quality.
Can anything be registered as a trademark?
No, it can't. It has to be able to distinguish what are your goods from those of somebody else. So, for example, if what you have is a computer, anybody can, well, sell a computer, calling it a computer. That's why people will come out with words such as Apple, so they've distinguished their goods from those of somebody else. So that's the importance of a trademark.
Now, how does registering a trademark actually benefit a business?
Well, a trademark actually, if you've got it registered, gives you the right to exclusive use of that trademark. So it means somebody else cannot use the same or a similar mark, but only in relation to the goods or services for which that mark has been registered. Well, that means that if what you've got is a trademark such as polo, that can be registered for confectionery as it is, but because it's going to be distinguished and different from other goods such as the Volkswagen polo, those two can coexist. Similarly, if we've got another polo such as clothing, shirts, it doesn't mean you have rights just to that word. Somebody else might be able to get rights to that word, but in relation to the defined goods and services to which we referred earlier.
So what are the risks in not being registered?
Well, if you use a trademark, then of course it gets more well known, and if it gets more well known, then the reputation builds. And if the reputation builds, then of course the value to the business is that much greater. So if you get rights in a trademark, then in fact all those rights will accrue to the trademark and the owner of those trademarks. If you don't, then there are two possible problems. The first is in fact that if someone else starts using the trademark, then they can actually benefit from the reputation you've built up. You've spent all that time, all that money building up reputation in a trademark, and yet they can come along and they can use your trademark or a similar trademark. There might be confusion, and of course if their goods are worse than yours, then you don't want to be linked in with them. And unfortunately that's what might happen. The other side is if they try to register the trademark. Because if they try to register the trademark, they will get all the benefits that you have built up over the years, whatever it may be. But the fact is, they get the benefits, and they might even be able to prevent you from using the trademark. It's like then you're going to have to start all over again from scratch. You've got to choose yet another trademark, and they've got everything that you've built up.
So having registered your trademark, have you done all that you need to do to protect your business?
No, you haven't. Because if you've got a registered trademark, you do have rights in it. But you have to discover if somebody else is trying to take over those rights, or at least use your rights. So what you do need is a trademark watching service. It's something we provide, which in fact is very cheap, but very, very sensible. We have a look at all the trademarks journals where trademarks are advertised, so you get to know that people are actually trying to get rights in your trademark or a similar trademark. And we tell our clients whether the marks might be similar and whether they're covering the same or similar services. And if they are, then of course it's up to them to decide whether they want to oppose its registration, to actually make sure they protect their marks and stop somebody else getting the rights. And it's not very expensive, because if we're looking at, say, the United Kingdom, it's less than £70 for a whole year. And worldwide, it's about £90, a bit less than £90 for a whole year, just to have a trademark watching service. And it's well worth it.
Well, Francis Preedy from Hallmark IP, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we've got time for in this programme, but if you'd like to find out more about any of the organisations that we've featured, then visit our website, thebusinesschannel.tv. Bye-bye for now.